welcome to Crank It Up. I'm Jim Price, and on this episode of Teaching Power, I want to continue the sub-series about power and talk about managing power creep. But I also uploaded another video today, and I'm asking if you haven't already watched it, please watch it and consider participating in that important cause. In Smash Up, there are a few concrete overarching strategies that help you be successful, and of those, two of them are in direct competition with each other. Today's video will focus on one of those two, managing a concept that I call power creep. This video will discuss three important matters: what is power creep, why you should avoid it, and how that actually happens. Power creep is built on the idea that Smash Up uses a shared power system. Every power that you add to a base is power that another player can ultimately utilize for their purposes. This reality became solidified for me during Monster Smash because of Uber Serum. Uber Serum is a very interesting card, but while trying out Mad Scientists, I noted aloud that the power on the base was creeping too close for my comfort, and thus the term was born. It feels like creeping because if you don't pay attention, it really sneaks up on you, as every power adds up quickly. Every now and then someone points out that it is also a magic term. Literally someone just did as I began working on this video, but 5 years and 500 videos later, I really don't care, because this isn't magic, and Smash Up vehemently denies that it deprecates cards anyway, rendering the magic definition moot. But I'm not here to argue a term, I'm here to teach, because I believe that this is the most fundamental aspect of understanding how to play Smash Up. Before we can manage power creep, we need to understand it. To understand it, we need to talk about a few key principles. The first one is an astute observation by my friend Judd Brown, which I've mentioned before on the channel. He once asked why we give the best abilities to minions with the highest power, which limits the opportunity to use those abilities because they don't last as long on a base. And there's a lot of truth in that. The desire to play an engine minion runs up against the fact that every power matters and we could be helping our opponents. To see how, consider some basic facts. On a 20 power base, if I add 8, my opponent needs 12. If I add 5, they need 15. If I add 2, they need 18. The more I add, the less they need to. The less I add, the more they have to. This makes Smash Up a game of efficiency. Consider this from another viewpoint. Total deck power. Outside of action boosts, your typical deck has 60 power. That would break 3 20-point bases. Unless all bases were 5 EP, that isn't enough to win the game. Simply put, you need rival players to help you win. But we also know that you don't just get your 60 power automatically. You have to draw into it over the course of the game. That adds another resource other than pure power: time. The more you invest in a base, the more time it takes to recover a comparable amount. If I spend 2 power for second place, then my hand is either probably well stocked for my own burst later, or recovering from a previous burst I just did. Combining all of these ideas, you can see that the goals of managing power creep are pretty clear. Add the right amount of power to win a base by considering it bottom up. Start small, that way if you lose efficiently, and your rival preferably wins inefficiently. Look for opportunities to cause your rival to overinvest for second place, because that makes it harder for them to take successive firsts. This means that you are thinking about your turns incrementally, making each base a progression that ultimately ends in a high numerical power burst. Tying back to last week's video, the power concepts that make this happen are power activation and terminal power. Power activation is awesome because you have a chance to utilize that power while your rivals cannot. If you have a 4 power minion, that's 4 power on everyone's turn. If it is a 2 who can become a 4, that's 4 power on your turn only, meaning that you have a virtual 2 power to play with that your rivals cannot access. But as I said last week, power activation is rarely a high number. Terminal power tends to be larger. So you need to view these two concepts together, but you also need to consider it from your rival's perspective. The simplest way to describe this is with a question. How much power can any player add on a single given turn? Let's look at some examples. For Zombie Vampires No Titan, it is 12. You can play a leader, play another leader with They Keep Coming, and play a Tenacious Z. 12 is not great. I find it to be pretty average actually. Sometimes it is much more variable than that. Consider Fairies, who can play Titania to play Puck for 8 power, and Puck's extra action could be Enchantment. Depending on the number of minions in play, Enchantment could add a significant amount of power, and you still have an action for something like Daisy Chain. I will admit, though, that I don't fixate on the specific number as much as I used to, simply because it is time consuming. If you ask me how much power Cyborg 8 Musketeers can add in a single turn, I just assume that anything I do is going to be too much and focus on ranges instead. Instead of asking how much power a combo can add, you might consider asking, can this combo add 12? Can it add 15? I find that this is often just as effective and infinitely shorter, making for a much more enjoyable experience for everyone. I do this because if I'm putting the base 15 away, whether or not they can make 16 or 20 or more doesn't matter, because 15 is the only number that matters right now. When a breakpoint is sufficiently low, sometimes this means that the opening minion becomes a very relevant question. One time on an engine point base, my rival added an engine base 4 to start off, putting it 14 away. Unfortunately, I responded with Mechanic to play Enshrouding Mist, to play Steam Queen and Agromotive, which is 14 power. This ended up stealing the game on Oracle of Delphi, but depending on the game state, that play of a 4 may or may not be the right play. Oracle of Delphi is strangely low for 4VP. Most in that range are 3 to 1. If you burn an elite so that I burn an elite leader in 2 great actions, that seems like a win for the second place victor, especially if I only get 3 points. Obviously, the same move early in the game versus late game also has an impact. If I use all those cards early, it is going to make my late game harder, whereas doing so at the end of the game doesn't matter. This leads into an important caveat of managing power creep: acceptable risk. Truthfully, there are times where adding 2 power is too much, because the combo is that explosive. This is definitely true of Itty Grims. They can play the Charming Combo with a minion play and teamwork, then they can play a Critter Coach to grab a Griminion, and teamwork for another Griminion. Despite the card cost involved, this means that on an average base, literally anything I add reduces their cost and increases the VP that they can get. But the alternative is not getting points, which may be worse. Of course, it requires tremendous hand management to set this up, and what makes Itty Grim so potent is their infinite recursion and the staggering number of ways that they can approximate this play without even factoring in their power activation. So given the complexity of the play, sometimes you have to set up a play knowing that you might lose that base. It is completely plausible that you may lose something good, but you force your rival to overextend themselves, which delays them for several turns. Thus there is some level of acceptable risk, but there is another risk that you have to consider. Is 1 minion enough? This is the case where destruction is particularly potent because the threat of removal can create inefficiencies. If I add a single 2 power, if I lose that minion, I lose my entire presence and get no VP as a result. If second place VP is high enough, it might mean committing a second minion, which means I am creeping the power even more. It's a delicate balance. How badly do I want that VP versus how easy do I want to risk making it easy for someone else? Is it a 2-point spread or a 1-point spread? As a general rule, I never let myself get soloed on a 3VP second place base, and if I'm going to get soloed there, the player is going to have to earn it. When we combine this reality with the first point, you start to see a list of considerations. How much power can I add on my turn? How much power can they add on theirs? How many minions can they remove on their turn? And by extension, how many minions can I remove on my turn? And above all else, is it worth it? Even if I can, should I? Considering these factors, I wanted to share a general game plan that I have found works for me. The general game plan involves playing slowly, bursting on my turn, and being intentional about all my plans. It means understanding how a combo is going to burst, and more importantly, what minion ranks I will be bursting from. This is important because even with bad abilities, minions still get the base power of their rank, and that power is always power creep. Looking at a few examples, we see that steampunks burst from their mechanics. This means that I am setting up with Steamman and Ahab, and Steamman is realistically a 4, so I need to play in a way in which 4 is not too much. Werewolves burst from their howlers, which is probably why everyone hates werewolves but me, without the great talent killer, which means that I am playing top down with my higher ranked minions being played first. Mythic horses burst from their soldiers, and the very definition of rainbow and sharing power means that I am looking at 6 to 7 power on a base at the start of my turn. If I know what cards I will be using to burst, I can start planning turns ahead, because I think that if I can add X on turn 3, and if I assume my rival adds Y, I start getting a clearer picture of how much power is unfolding over each turn. I don't have hard numbers on this, but I generally feel like bases are often a 5-turn attack, at least 2-player. This means that 5-player turns pass before a base breaks, sometimes faster, but that is still a good starting point. Consider the average burst of zombie vampires, which we said was 12. If that is a turn 5 burst, that leaves 8 power to add over the last 4 turns, which would mean 2s every turn, which checks out because that is the bare minimum that someone could realistically add each turn. In the power activation context, consider a Kree Sentry. It can activate 2 power, which basically subtracts a turn from the 5-turn plan. That means that I can spread out and do something else, de-risking my investment on the target base. Not only am I saving cards, but I am saving tempo. Those cards took turns to play. So consider playing your power activation cards early, especially if the thing that activates them is also the thing that does your burst. Kree are a great example of this. Kree Sentry wants actions played, and you could easily play 2 actions for at least 4 power, but definitely more than that. Similarly, the act of playing cards to power up Haunting relies on those cards adding power as well, like the Dead Rise. Movement is another way to naturally manage power creep because it is often the case that you can move, but your rivals cannot. By diversifying your bases, you keep your investment low on each one, forcing your rival to split their focus or overcommit on a base you swarm to. Movement itself can be and has been its own video topic, but movement naturally compounds with engine abilities. It is the solution to the Judd Brown paradox about leaders and abilities, because at least you aren't forced to double up on a base prematurely. Another way to manage power creep is simply do nothing on a base and then explode. Sometimes you need to create your own efficiencies. You can't go 0 to breakpoint on everything, but why would you want to? The less you add, the more your rival has to add, and unless they have power activation or extreme extra plays, it means that they have to add power through minion quantity and persistent power. This means that sometimes you can sit back and wait and add all your cards in one go. My faction of choice for this is Halflings, because their cards naturally chain together, and you could order your plays in the right way such that you maximize Quarterling and Bardling, or just Rude Awakening right past them. Burying by its very nature avoids power creep because the cards are not in play until they are. The best example of this for me is World Champion Mummy. It's basically a 2-power activation card that helps with minion quantity benefits, which the World Champions unfortunately don't have, but still, you can see the value. Because there is only one card to uncover, it ties into your free uncovering. As you will see with Stasis and Scoring, there are other mechanics that approximate the same effect of deferring plays so that you, and only you, can utilize them. Each system uses a different mechanism for creating its payoff, but I'll have more to say about them as the next expansion gets closer to releasing. The final way worth mentioning for this video is probably the rarest, but it's gotten more attention than usual lately because of some new cards. If you can suppress other people's plays, that increases your risk threshold. In general, the less you let other players do, the more they can get away with. For example, loading up on hatchlings increases the risk tolerance since hatchlings will provide depowering that generally scales with the printed power. Sirens have a similar alternate effect. Ghostly Presence ability to block 3s eliminates many combinations of burst plays and limits the chances of having the right minion. Of course, if Eliza is in play, the theoretical power per turn goes down, so you can get away with more. With the new Ghostbusters faction, we have breakpoint increases, which obviously accomplishes a similar goal. Finally, there is an advanced concept called negative power negation, which applies here as well, but rather than going into it in detail, consider a card like Becalmed Shores. It's like reverse power activation. Instead of turning on positive power, you are turning off negative power, so you can use that as yet another factor. If you manage power creep effectively, you actually do more than protect a minion's base. The higher power minion in play, the more susceptible they are to waste strategies and antagonistic movement. Instead of pulling a 5, you are pulling a 2. If you use summon style cards non-terminally, then you are risking both actions and minions, limiting your future burst. This playstyle lets you conserve your best minions and actions and make them count, while accepting the reality that losing a base can still win you the game. This means simple things, like being wary of single-digit breakpoint distances, never playing your leader as your second minion, and deciding what is a base you cannot afford to lose. It's also important to note that you can manage power creep and still lose because your opponent is trying to do the same thing. But after countless games of Smash Up, combined with the collective experience of my peers, I remain convinced that, in the vast majority of cases, this is the correct way to approach a base. Breaking bases can be expensive. Don't make it easier for other players. Don't be turned off by a faction's low footprint, because that is exactly the point. Factions with strong recruits who can lead off a base do this really well. I found that power creep management lets me win games using combos that have no business winning, and by following this strategy, I hope you can be successful too. Do you agree with this style of play? What factions have you found do it particularly well, and which ones don't? Let me know in the comments. Thanks for watching. Be sure to like and subscribe. Let's shut it down.